And welcome to episode 58 of the Brood Sages, Stormbound Players with a Head for the Game. I am Freeloader, and with me, as always, are Sabaiku and Thomas. Sabaiku, how's it going tonight?
Fantastic.
And Thomas, how are you doing?
Pretty all right.
We are the Brood Sages, easily the second best Stormbound-related podcast in production. And as a reminder, you can always follow us at Brood Sages on Twitter. Or for all of you who confuse Pinterest with Instagram, our email address is thebroodsages@gmail.com. For everyone listening, we are experiencing technical difficulties tonight, so apologies in advance if this isn't the best recording we've ever done. We're trying out an entirely new system tonight, solely for making it work when we don't have great internet. But we thought this was a really important episode to do. We got a wonderful email from Dragonstar 5674 or 5674. I don't know how they pronounce their last name. Who's also known as West on Discord. And they wrote, just going to give you a quick sample of some of the stuff they wrote from their wonderful email. Thank you very much. Just wanted to say that I've taken to playing Stormbound recently after a 3-year hiatus, and it's been a really enjoyable experience. Thrilled to hear that. We obviously love this game to the point that we decided to make a podcast about it. It's always great to hear other people love playing. In the 2 months I've played, I've been lucky enough to climb up to Diamond with the help of members of the community and, of course, podcast episodes. We are very thankful that you bothered to ever spend time listening to us. We try to be insightful. It's really nice to hear that you find us insightful. That's great. However, for other newer players, easy access to tutorials, starting level content can be difficult to find. I think it would be neat if you made an episode that touches on maybe not the super basic fundamentals of the game, but for those neat little quirks about Stormbound that we all love it for. So this is a wonderful idea. And Sabaiku pointed out that we've done a few things kind of like this in the past, not to this degree of like an actual tutorial-ish. But we've honed in on specifics of playing, and those have been some of the more popular podcasts that we've produced. So we said, why not? Let's do it. We're not going to get into the fundamental basic mechanics of the game. If you want those, they are wonderfully well documented. In the battle guide at Stormbound Kitty, we will include the link to that battle guide in our show notes. So if you're looking for that, just check the notes. You can even hit pause on this. We won't mind. And go. Stormbound Kitty is just an amazing repository. Moving on from there, though, let's get into some of the I'm thinking of this, guys, more as like if you are either like a veteran player who could use a refresher because it never hurts, or a newish player, right? We've got macro strategy issues, we've got micro strategy issues, we've got resource management considerations, and then we've got laddering and just sort of like general how to improve kind of stuff, right? And I think if you go through and take a look at like the top 20-30 players in Stormbound, they have individually like specific strengths. They're really good macro players. They're really good micro strategy players. They're really good ladder players, right? And so for all of you who think, I'm already, really, really solid. Yeah, you probably are in one area. Maybe there's another area that you'd like to start improve on, and hopefully maybe we can help sort of guide you into some ideas on where you might look for improvement there. So with that, let's start with the macro strategy. Sabaiku, so for macro strategy, how do you want to describe the idea of a macro strategy in Stormbound?
So I like to think of this as, what is the intent of the deck that I'm building? What is it trying to do? How is it going to win? And go from there to think about how I'm going to play any particular matchup. So there's a lot of overlap with deck building here, and a lot of overlap with the archetypes that we've started talking about, a couple of years ago at this point. Do you want to make a rush deck? Do you want to make a mid-range deck? Do you want to make a control deck? And which faction do you want to put it in? What is each faction good at? So to start with, it really depends on your play style and what you enjoy playing and what you are trying to get out of your Stormbound experience. Like me personally, I tend toward decks that are pretty high tempo with just a little bit of value. So I would say probably like an aggressive mid-range deck, a little bit of flexibility, but mostly rushy. So to that end, I keep the mana curve low in my decks because that fits what the deck is trying to do, which is win the game relatively quickly with a little bit of a backup option in case it can't get there. Um, a lot of macro strategy is also around what combos are you including in your deck. Maybe you're making a Shadowfen Rush deck, so your combo here is really Rain of Frogs and Obsidian Butchers, and you want to try to keep them together. Does your deck even work if these cards aren't together? These are the things you gotta think about as you're putting the deck together, but also as you're going into each matchup, you got to think about what am I trying to do in this match as a whole, and that's where the macro level of the strategy comes in. It's what am I trying to do in this match as a whole. It's not just I'm trying to win, but how am I trying to win? How am I trying to get there?
So, Thomas, this is interesting. Uh, when you build a deck, how much of the deck do you like? How much of that process do you put into what do you have to counter? What am I going to see on ladder? Like, I want to build a deck. I want it to be a winter deck. I want it to do X, Y, Z. Oh, but I better make sure that I've got a counter, some way to handle Rain Bragda. I better make sure I've got some way to handle Buck stacks. Like, do you find yourself allotting like 33% of your deck slots or something? I'm just making a number up there. Do you find yourself allotting a certain percentage of your deck slots to, I know what the meta looks like and feels like, and I better have these counter cards to those decks? Or do you just sort of start with, this is what I want to do, and then if I start losing, I'll adjust by adding in the cards necessary to compensate?
I definitely choose the second option because until you really start playing a whole lot of games and start getting a feel for what all of your opponents are trying to do in general, it's better to create a strategy around what you feel more comfortable with and what you're best at. So create the thing that is best for you. Obviously, this is my own personal opinion, and so I'm just speaking, I guess, in third person. So like create the deck that is the best for you, the best game plan, the best win conditions for your style of play. And then as you start seeing more of one thing or another, I generally don't put more than two sideboard slots or two, I guess, tech cards into a deck for a certain matchup that's really, really rough for me to try and shore those up. Unless you're really, really, really sick of a certain archetype and you just trying to annihilate that thing because you want that out of the game permanently. Last month with Rain Bragda.
That's fair. That's fair.
But yeah, so I also then, like with that thought process in mind, I generally do go a little bit more rushy to start with because it's easier to start rushy, and then as you're getting your tech cards in, that generally slows your gameplay down and moves at the tempo, knowing whatever your opponents are playing. So if you need to start playing Loris because there's a lot of Zuri decks in the meta, you can slot that in. He's a little heavier card, so that's going to slow your deck down a little bit more, but that's fine to be able to completely shore that matchup up. So that's my general approach to the game.
That's interesting because that is the opposite of my approach when I'm building a deck. I always start slower and start with, combos that I want to hit or a long range game plan. And then inevitably, as the deck starts to lose, I just start to speed it up. This isn't working. I need to get rid of this 4 mana card and put in Gifted Recruits. This isn't working. I need to get rid of the 6 mana card and put in Wild Saber Paws. And yeah.
Yeah, I tend not to. I tend to really like to play my own home brews, right? Like, and in this game, that I'm not really sure what that means because there's only so many cards in a deck, and I'm never the first person to come up with a combo, right? Like, oh, Witches looks really good with Trekking Alderman. I want to build a deck around Witches and Trekking Alderman. Guess what? I wasn't the first person to do that. But, I kind of start from that kind of concept of, oh, I love how these two cards play with each other. I want to make a deck that focuses on that interaction. And I kind of go from there based on that interaction. Is it an aggressive interaction? Well, then I'm going to build an aggressive deck. Is it a defensive, like Witches and Trekking? Feels like a mid-rangey, I'm trying to like stave off aggression, right? Five damage from Trekking Alderman isn't a ton, but against a rush deck, 5 damage is a big deal. So, it feels like a rush counter kind of combo, and then I kind of build from there outward, right? Whatever the combo is that I want to have as the centerpiece of my deck defines the tempo versus value weight of the deck, if that makes sense.
So it's funny that I don't think we helped our listeners at all. We have one person who starts fast and starts slowing down as they start losing. One person who starts slow and starts speeding up as they lose, and then another person who just decides combo and builds around that. So,
well, yeah, but I think that's good. I mean, that what that means is all of them are viable. You just have to bear in mind what it is that you're doing.
Exactly, and that's exactly what I was about to get to then, is that so ultimately there is no correct answer. So basically, figure out which one it is that you prefer the most of all of these different clearly viable options, and stick with it and hone your skills in that method.
Yes, I think if we're going to get into the nitty gritty though of micro strategy, the thing to remember is so I have a very good idea from the get-go whether I'm a controllee deck or I'm the aggressor deck, right? And Sabaiku, you'll recall we both read a wonderful article talking about this back in I think it was talking both about Hearthstone and Magic the Gathering. Every matchup that you queue into, one player is the beat down, the aggressor, and the other one is the controlling deck. And it's not always clear who's who, especially in a mirror match where you basically have the same archetype in the same faction.
Yeah, that was an old Magic the Gathering article that has remained relevant in card games since then. And really, it's a question to me of tempo, and whoever is ahead on tempo is the one that is the aggressor, who is the beatdown, and whoever is behind on tempo has to play that control role. Now, some decks are better at playing that control role than others. Some are better at playing the aggressive role than others. So if you're a slower controlling deck and you're opening on 3 mana and you can't play a card, like, it doesn't matter that you went first. You're starting out the game behind on tempo. To me, I see tempo as essentially being ahead on board, applying pressure. So it's a combination of both frontline and strength. You want to be ahead on board in the sense that you have more strength than your opponent, but that strength doesn't mean too much when it's back on your own baseline. That strength has to be up near their base in order to be providing you with the ability to control the flow of the game.
Right. Tempo is effectively demanding a response from your opponent. If I put Lady Rhyme on my baseline, my opponent is not being demanded to respond to that. They can look at it and go, that's big. I'm just going to play around it. Putting a giant unit on my opponent's baseline, however, is essentially, hey, I win the game. If you don't do anything, you better have some sort of response. And so the higher the tempo, the more of that demanding of a response. You can't play the turn you want because what I have just done is forcing you to instead respond to me. I'm dictating the tempo of this game. And it's not always the more aggressive deck that gets to do that, because RNG of card draw, who gets to go first, all of these kinds of things. And the article really boiled down to a lot of the best players can identify when they have to misappropriate their deck. It's a control deck, but I have to behave like the aggressor because my opponent is also a control deck and I've got the tempo, so I've got to take advantage of that. Or we're both playing rush decks. Somebody has to be the control, otherwise it's just going to be whoever draws into whatever. Those are the key moments when you can identify the macro situation. Yes, I want to win, but in this particular matchup, I have to play this particular style, even with my deck that's not honed for it, in order to win. Thomas, do you ever find yourself like playing a rush deck but randomly just playing defense for like 3-4 turns until you can turn it around?
Oh, absolutely. That kind of stuff happens all the time, especially as I was going through the ranking world back when I had underleveled cards. A lot of people in gold would be playing something like, I guess this is back in the day when pretty much only Swarm Rush was the viable faction for Rush. And so you just start bouncing cards off each other until eventually one person gets a slightly luckier draw for the slightly more value cards, and that's the person that then ended up winning. So you basically just played defense the entire game, or both people played defense because you had the exact same deck, and it was just keeping your opponent off their front. And so it's really important to, as the game goes on, for sure understanding when you can start going, or I guess, when you're like the aggressor, like versus the defender.
I remember a specific stretch I was playing Reckless Rush's Swarm Rush deck, and I queued into about, I want to say something ridiculous, like out of 20 games, it was probably 12 or 13 mirror matches. And of those mirror matches, 4 or 5 of my opponents had Flooding the Gates teched into their deck. And so I couldn't believe that even though I had the initiative, they were just going right around me. They were letting me get onto their baseline. I base locked them. I'm like, holy smokes, this was the easiest game of my life. And then out of nowhere, I find out why they've been behaving like they're the beatdown. I'm like, well, how is it possible? I've got more units on your baseline than you have on mine. And then I lose the game. So, identifying isn't always easy, but it really is the key to being able to win in the micro strategy. Before we move on macro. Before we move on for macro, I think it would be good to sort of give a quick brief overview of the 4 factions and what we think each one is good at. I will start with Sabaiku. Give me what do you think when you think of winter? What do you think?
Oh, that's a great lead in here, because we've been talking about tempo and value, and winter has a lot of high value cards, but they have a lot of high value cards that create a lot of tempo at the same time. And that's why Winter Rush works so well. For example, there's some units floating around in the middle of the board in the first couple of turns. What do? Icicle Burst, Shyvana, turn their unit into your own 8 strength unit, and then still have 4 mana to continue to develop and attack. In the same way, Gift of the Wise allows you, if you survive to the late game, allows you to do more than your opponent, clear the board and apply pressure. It allows you to invest your early turns into damage like Saber Paws or Wolf Cloak's chip damage, because you know that you can come back and turn around that board even if you get behind and flip the tempo. So to me, that's the really big strength of Winter, especially through mana manipulation, is the ability to flip the tempo of the board so quickly on these pivotal turns.
Yeah, Thomas, to me, I think Sabaiku's hit it on the head here. Winter to me feels, hot or cold. It's either super aggressive builds that have a lot of very strong early turns that can, get extra value out of the turns with Icicle Jev and whatnot, or Mist Wives, or Wolf Cloaks, or it's super late game value stuff. But the mid range for Winter is the part that to me feels the least well defined.
I can 100% agree with that. If we want to move on, I would say that the next faction that feels extremely close to Winter these days, when it comes to that description, would be Swarm.
Okay.
Swarm is generally either extremely aggressive or has the ability to be very, very controlling with Dark Harvest and Broken Truce, and then like Pillars of Doom. And so Swarm is actually probably even more dangerous to misguess, or to misguess whichever type your opponent is playing. If you think that they're playing Swarm Control and they're actually playing Swarm Rush, you just lose instantly. And it can be very easy to lose if you think that they're playing Swarm Rush, and so you're playing a little bit more controlly, and then they plop a Pillars of Doom a mile away from you.
They don't even have to plop a Pillars of Doom. A lot of times I feel like it's a Swarm Rush deck, and I'm just trying to clog the middle of the board by playing my mid-range units, 8, 10 health units in the middle of the board to make it impossible for them to get around me. And then instead they just drop Bucks, and suddenly 2 of their units are getting 10 health buffs. Like, Sabaiku, how difficult is it to be able to ascertain what kind of Swarm deck you're playing against?
It's very easy because it's always a Bucks deck. No, it is not literally always a Bucks deck, but I would say probably 4 out of 5 Swarm decks that I face are. It's just a question of how aggressive are they around the Bucks. Mm-hmm. The control tools are there in Swarm, but like it's Broken Truce and Dark Harvest, so it's stuff that you can kind of work around if you know it's a slower deck. Although to Thomas's point, it's not always easy to identify that it's a slower deck, because control decks do tend to play the same cheap cards as most rush decks. It's just they deploy them defensively to slow the game down, and that might not be so easy to ascertain in the early game. But defensively, Swarm cards like Head Start and Doppelbox don't really do anything. So if you see a card like that, all right, I can attack. They can't play defense well with these cards, and that at least enables an opening there for you.
That's fair.
Well, it gives you an indicator what deck they are. I'm kind of the same way that Winter. It's pretty straightforward whether they're going to be a rush deck or one of those large mana decks by that turn 1 of Lost Psyches or Freebooters.
Right. Gosh. Yeah, you see Freebooters, you know what you're up against, and that helps.
But yeah, you see green prototypes into Frost Hexers, and you're like, not sure.
Yep.
Ironclad still now feels like a mid-range faction. There is the Mia True Shot controlling deck out there, and there are some builds that are more rushy. But
sure, Heartguard is still strong, yeah.
Yeah. But even a lot of their aggressive mid-range decks. Remember, we had a huge problem for a while. Couldn't tell the difference between Ironclad Rush and Ironclad mid-range, because the mid-range deck that was being played was a unstable build Hearthguards deck, and it was like, well, it's just sort of mid-rangey with this really rushy feel to it. And Ironclad still just kind of feels like it's a good all-around mid-range deck. No?
Yeah, you can build it in different directions, but in general, you're probably seeing either an aggressive mid-range deck that runs, like Scrapped and tries to finish with unstable Hearthguards, or a slower mid-range deck that is going to try to work around some upgrade point Mia shenanigans.
Yeah, I would say that the sweet spot for Ironclad is still anywhere between rush to mid-range, and then onto Shadowfen, it's like mid-range to control. I'd say in general, Shadowfen's doing a little bit better job at the heavier side of the mana curve and gameplay than Ironclad. Just by
For sure. Especially now that Rain got nerfed to 3 mana, like any of those fast Lime Limbs with Rain Butchers follow-ups, those kinds of decks just aren't really viable anymore. You need to add more heavy hitters to it. But Ironclad, yeah, Greengale's. I feel like Greengale was better with Rain in the meta, and now it's not as good. But Windmakers at 4 is still pretty darn excellent.
Yeah, definitely. It's still a viable card for sure.
And I have played around with the Trekking Alderman opener into Destructobots on 2, and I can tell you that that's busted when it happens. It's nowhere near as easy to make happen as Trekking with Witches, which is why I've opted to go with Shadowfen for my controlling decks that use Trekking. Trekking is a wonderful card in Shadowfen, and I agree with Thomas. Subaiku, you agree as well that Shadowfen right now is less of a rushy faction and more of a mid-range to control?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, actually. It's a great way to look at it. The Ironclad has that kind of more aggressive mid-range spot in the meta, and Shadowfen has the more heavy mid-range spot. And, you can kind of tech those decks to go in either direction, but it's a real good starting point.
Yeah, and for my particular personal favorite playstyle, Shadowfen still sits in there. That control-y mid-range deck is always where I kind of end up sitting. Let's move on from here. We'll simply mention that if you want to have a better understanding of tempo versus value, you can always go back to our episodes 11 and 12, where we talk about those two concepts in further detail. But so that's the macro strategy, right? You come into it, I need to figure out my deck is a controlling style deck. This looks like a rush deck. I'm the control, they're the beatdown. Let's move from that kind of thought process into the micro strategy, right? Micro strategy is more things like positioning. Where am I going to put units, cycling, order of play kind of concepts, and just, what resources are appropriate for this particular matchup? Which cards should I not play? A great example of that is in the Shadowfen v Shadowfen. Never drop what I refer to as a naked Rain. Don't play Rain and leave it on the board for your opponent to use. But in general, let's talk through some of these ideas. Thomas, give me some thoughts on unit positioning. If I'm a solid player who's looking to improve myself, what kinds of things do you think I'm not necessarily taking into account when I position units on the board?
I guess the very first one that comes to mind is just something that happened earlier today. An opponent was too aggressive coming towards my baseline, and I wasn't going to be able to clear all of their stuff. And everything walking in was going to put me at one health, and so I wasn't able to do anything else about it. And so I just put on my turn, then I just put all my stuff on their baseline, locking them out. And it's like, well, if you don't have a runner, then I win. And they didn't have a runner, so I won. So when it comes to playing, you really got to think about, even if if you're gonna just try and do something like that, you need to not be too aggressive and not force your opponent to just also go all out then. Just leave one unit behind, and to not let them just base lock you if you don't have a runner in your deck.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Baiku, in general, how much do you weight units on your baseline versus units on your second row? Like your opponent has let's say a gifted recruits in a corner on your baseline. How important do you think it is to clear that versus just clogging up that second row to prevent any further runners?
The answer is, how easy is it to clear that? How easy is it to reset my opponent's front line? If I'm not going to be able to reset my opponent's front line, the answer is definitely clog up your second row. You just mentioned effectively using your resources. Your base health is a resource. We have talked about that in the past for sure.
Mm-hmm.
You can definitely eat up, 4 or 5 damage without really worrying about your opponent ending the game in one hit. So if you can keep them off of your baseline, make it easier for you to clear the following turn, then that's definitely preferable. I would say that's probably, you asked Thomas what to consider in positioning. That's the hardest thing for me, is not where am I going to put these units this turn, but where are they going to end up the following turn, because of either how they will move or because of what my opponent will do. And always trying to keep in mind that your opponent has time to respond to what you're doing. So try to set them up. And that's a little more difficult. For something like Loris, for example, if I have Loris in my deck, I will try to keep my opponent's units together, because it's more likely that I'll get value out of Loris that way, and that they'll be bordering, and Loris will be able to clear multiple units. If I don't have Loris in my deck, but I have something like Windmakers, it's the same thing. Try to steer your opponent toward playing them together so that your cards are more effective. And that's all through setting up the positioning early to take advantage of it later.
Yeah, I have found with both Loris and Windmakers actually that their best effectiveness, for me at least, has been as an enabler to go aggressive. I have Loris in hand. I can dump the rest of my hand on their baseline and just let them put pressure on my baseline the following turn. Like, I know there's a unit on my penultimate row right now. I'm going to hit go and it's going to be on my baseline. I'm going to give them the opportunity to put, another unit on my baseline, and he's probably going to use the rest of his mana to clear my aggression near his baseline. That's the better play. I'm setting up the Loris that way, because if my opponent puts 2 units on my baseline, Loris helps clear both. Windmakers does the same kind of thing. I have struggled to try to play in the mid board in any sort of way that incentivizes my opponent to play into Loris. I've just never been able to accomplish that.
It usually requires leaving a unit of theirs on the board and setting it up so that when their unit walks forward, your unit is next to it. Think about it in the same way if they open with Destructobots.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't clear it, what do? You park a unit bordering it so that they can't play linked golems next to it and advance their front. If they want to play linked, they have to do it behind.
Right.
And that gives you a little more time to respond. That's what you have to do in the mid game, is just think about where their units are going to end up and position your units accordingly so that you're setting up that bordering aspect.
That's fair. I'll throw a couple of other ideas out there. When you're playing against a Shadowfen opponent and they're making a column and you read Zuri, you don't always have to try to clear the whole column.
Sorry, you said Shadowfen opponent?
Oh, it's a swarm opponent, pardon me. And you read Zuri and you see them making a column and you're trying to figure out whether or not you can clear their entire column, and you're like, I'd have to use up everything. Another option, if their front unit is on your penultimate row or in the middle row and will move to your penultimate row at the start of their turn, is to simply stick a unit without movement on your baseline right in front of all of it. I do that a lot, where I'll just go aggressive with everything and then just play one non-moving unit like Frost Hexers on my baseline right in front of the column. So then I hit go, their column moves forward, and now there's no room for Zuri to land. So they cannot actually get Zuri value. Positioning doesn't always have to be about denying movement. Sometimes it can be about things like denying Zuri value over the top of the movement, right? Like, think about not just where the units are now, but where they're going to move. Thomas, I just had a wonderful draft win I was quite proud of. I base locked my opponent by putting a big unit in front of their Phoenix. I didn't kill their Phoenix. I loaded up their baseline so that there was only one open cell, and then I let my unit kill Phoenix at the start of their turn. I hit end turn, Phoenix moved forward, crashed into it, respawned on their baseline, and created the base lock. It was glorious. Those kinds of things about predicting the movement at the start of your opponent's next turn. How often do you find yourself thinking about, oh, well, if I put my unit here, there's no way they can kill it because all of their units are going to move forward and surround it or whatever?
Oh, all the time. You have to be completely focused on that. But not only the movement, I wanted to go back over to the Zuri thing, because not only do you have to think about the movement and that additional front line, but the total value that they're going to get. If you're reading like Zuri, they're obviously going to be able to get an extra movement forward no matter what. And so you also want to think about the total value that they're going to get. If you really spent all of your resources to try and wipe out their front line, but then you have no front line, that just means that you guys have both been reset, but now it's the beginning of their turn, and they're going to be able to start setting up a really good Zuri turn in 2 more turns, because you now have 0 front this turn. So sometimes it's better to just let them have a Zuri over 1 unit, because otherwise in 2 turns, they could have a Zuri over 2 or 3 units. So sometimes you just got to give them the value in order to not have a whole lot of value given to them just a little bit later.
Yeah, to me, positioning is really about trying to deny what your opponent wants to do or trying to set up what you want to do. And that's it. Like, pick one of those 2 actions and try to position accordingly.
Is there any good rule of thumb either of you can think of? I cannot. But is there any good rule of thumb that either of you can think of about how often you should be more mindful of your own, this is what I'm trying to do, versus how often you should be trying to deny what they're trying to do?
It comes down to your macro strategy, right? We just talked about a lot of that.
100%. Your deck, the deck that you put together. If you are an aggressive deck and at the beginning of the game you read that your deck is more aggressive than theirs, that's what you need to prioritize, and vice versa.
Just go. Okay. All right.
If you built a control deck and when you start the game and you feel that your deck is more controlling than your opponent's, or heck, you built a control deck, but you feel your deck is a little bit more aggressive than your opponent's, even because they built a slower control deck, then you start playing your deck a little bit more aggressively, and that's what you need to prioritize.
Yeah, that's often when I do my streams, Subeku, we'll often have that conversation somewhere like around mana 7, 8, or 9, right? Where we're suddenly like, I have to push. If I don't push, they're just going to outvalue me the rest of the game. Like there's this realization at some point in the game where we're just like, oh, we just saw that card. Oh gosh, if they're playing that card, then there's no way for us to win the long game. It has to be aggression from here on out, right?
Yeah, it drives me crazy when your games go to 9 mana. That's ridiculous.
Maybe that's what I should have said, though, back over on the macro strategy. Regardless of what deck you put together right away, try and what your opponent is doing. And if you feel that you're the more aggressive deck, you are now suddenly an aggressive deck, and you need to play like that. And if you feel like you're a control lead deck in comparison to them, then you need to play towards that.
This is exactly why I love cards like Trekking over HV, right? I'm a control-y kind of player, but HV does not ever allow me to be aggressive. HV is not an aggressive card. So if I suddenly queue into like a winter health gain kind of like Ulf and Underground Springs kind of deck, it's like, oh no, I just need to be as aggressive as I can. What on earth am I ever doing with HV in that matchup? But at least Trekking is 7 health on the board, right? Like at least it's some amount of pressure, even if it's not played on their baseline. My preference towards cards that provide that sort of flexibility, Loris being another one, Ubis being one as well, right? Like there's a lot of cards that I think part of the reason, Subeku, why we see so much play of them is because their flexibility allows them to be in both controlling and or aggressive decks. And their preference for doing so is that they give you both kind of like, well, I need to be the beatdown right now. At least Loris is a 10-1.
Right? At least Loris has movement that gives you a little more tempo than some of the other cards you could play in that spot.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another thing that we often talk about in my streams, I will not randomly, but I will occasionally play my cards out first and then cycle. And I'll explain when I'm doing it, that I'm doing this first because in this matchup, this card is terrible and I never want to see it again. Cycling should usually be done first, but if you have a card that you think is not an appropriate card for this matchup, what do you guys think about holding it in hand and then just playing out the rest of your hand and throwing it away for at the end?
It very much depends on the rest of my hand and whether or not I can efficiently utilize my mana or if I'm looking for something specific.
Fair enough.
If a card is real bad and the rest of my hand is real good, I'll just play out the rest of my hand and then cycle later. If my hand is mediocre, I will cycle first often, just trying to look for something better to play.
Yep, absolutely.
But it does mean that there's not a like hard and fast rule that you should always cycle first. You have to be more cognizant of that, of what your hand is and what the matchup is, right? Before you start doing stuff like that.
To me, that's all about efficiently utilizing your resources, right? Your resources in this case being mana and cards in hand. You only have 4 cards in hand unless you take some pirates into your deck to manipulate that. You only ever have the mana that you start the turn with unless you're playing Winter and you get to manipulate that. So make sure that you're using it as efficiently as you can, and if that means that you can cycle at the end of your turn because you're already in good shape, then fine, do that. But just kind of be aware of the situation, be aware of your opponent. Like you said, maybe I never want to play Hunter's Vengeance in this matchup because they're playing Shadowfen with Rain of Frogs, and I'm only going to kill a 1-strength frog and my whole board. So maybe I will cycle that away last, just because to your point, I never want to see it. It's all very context. It's all very context dependent. It's not a hard and fast rule.
Yep. It's also dependent on what's in your deck. So if you have your deck memorized, then you'll know what you need to draw into versus if it doesn't matter if you draw into something else. Like you've got Melodious Sisters in your deck and Siege Breakers, and neither of their abilities are currently relevant for the turn. You might as well just throw the Melodious Sisters out, because who cares if you cycled into something that has the exact same strength and no ability.
Right. And the other thing that I want to mention in here is there are cards that speed up your cycle that I think in general people see as a detriment. And it's funny, like, when you get started in this game, everybody thinks green prototypes is terrible. Why do I want to play a card that's going to buff my opponent's units? And slowly but surely, as you get to be a better player, you start to appreciate the value of being able to move your front for 1 mana. I feel like both First Mutineers and Summon Militia are cards that wonderfully get you through your deck faster, and certain decks need that ability. Like if Summon Militia's text was 1 mana, draw an extra card at the start of your next turn. Oh, and here's a unit on the board randomly. People would appreciate the value of Summon Militia like 4 or 5 times more than they do. It's not a card for every deck, but it really does have a space in there, no?
In a lot of decks, yes. I used to play it in every single deck ever, and then as I think Heroes League came out, it suddenly ceased to exist in every one of my decks ever.
Well, Subaika, we're in the middle of a rather heavy mid-range meta, as we have been for quite a while, right? Like at some point, having too many 1-drops is just not all that great unless you are a hyper-aggressive cycling deck, right?
Yeah, now I feel like now you're playing mostly green prototypes and erratic neglects if you want a second 1 mana card.
Yeah,
and very rarely do you want a third 1 mana card. Like you said, very specific decks. For me, it's really only super aggressive winter decks, decks that are trying to get to Giovanna very consistently on 5 mana, or my Seabass deck, which is a ton of fun, but just requires you to blow through it very quickly in order to come back around to Ubis again and again.
But
Yep.
and Thomas, you were a huge proponent of not freebooters, pardon me, First Mutineers in draft mode, because in draft mode, you only have a few cards that are high level, and having a card that helps you cycle through all of those, especially one that you then choose to level up consistently, so it's a 3 mana 5 health that's cycling you to your other level 5 cards, is fairly broken in the mode, no?
It's absolutely. I love that, and I'm still gonna I'm just always gonna keep it as a tier 0. Summon Militia is also a tier 0. It's an auto include. If I see that in draft, I snap pick it, and I don't waste my levels on Summon Militia because you get that tempo on the board and cycle through your deck a little bit faster to your other cards that you do want to level up that have better value. It absolutely is a tier 0 card in my opinion. And I also draft Soap Cleanse all the time as well because of the concept.
Love it.
Oh dear. So for the micro stuff, we've hit on a lot of these decisions about like positioning of units. There was one other one that I wanted to mention about positioning of unit. Oh, it was that I have seen a relatively decent number of people open with Destructobots on one on an outer column. You are inviting me as your opponent to simply clog the only place that you could play linked golems for value plus movement, right? You should always if you're going to open with Destructobots hoping to find linked golems on your following turn, please play it in an inner row.
Nope, there's a reason for it. Actually, I do the same thing.
You play it on an outer column? What on earth are you doing?
I am avoiding Sparkly Kitties. A 50% chance of Sparkly Kitties clearing it.
So you'd
in a row. My opponent starts their turn with a Wild Saber Paws or a Gifted Recruits into Sparkly Kitties. If I had it on one of the 2 center rolls, they guarantee clear my Destructobots.
That's hilarious. So it's only since Sparkly Kitties has entered the meta that this has changed your behavior then.
Yep. And playing it on the outside is absolutely the right play.
Wow, that's really, because it makes it so much more so much easier to just clog it and prevent the linked golems from being able to be played anywhere other than the behind of the Destructo.
That's fine, because you get crazy value out of it versus when Destructo gets cleared, you don't get any value whatsoever.
Right, and Link Golems is dead. Oh dear.
Yep. And you got a chance of drawing into your green prototypes for your Link Golems anyway, so you know, not a huge chance, but you get a couple extra draws at it.
Okay, so then never mind. Ignore what I said. If you are an Iron player opening with Destructobots, Sparkly Kitties is in the meta now. You should only ever play Destructo on the outer columns.
I do definitely use the outer columns way more than I used to.
Yeah.
Specifically because of Sparkly Kitties. Yeah.
Interesting. I have not.
I was always putting Doppel in one of the 2 inners because of the amount of times that I would play Dark Harvest in decks, and now it has to be outside.
Huh. That is super interesting. Yeah, no, it makes total sense. All right. These are the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about.
Yeah.
You're
ready to move on? Yeah.
Yeah.
So to summarize very quickly, macro strategy, what are you trying to do with your deck overall? What are you trying to do big picture in this matchup? Micro strategy, what are you trying to do with each card? What are you trying to do with each turn? Right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of how we break it down here.
And there are some players who are phenomenally good at being able to identify right away, oh, I've got to be the aggressor. Oh, I've got to be the defender. Oh, in this matchup, I know which cards are good and which aren't. And there's other players who can just look at a specific turn and immediately know what the optimal play for that turn is. These are two different skills. We're going to go from there. Actually, we're going to jump real quick to ladder ranks first before we get into resource management, because I feel like to end the conversation about playing and deck building and card selection, we want to go to ladder ranks next, which is like, how do we read the meta? How do we understand what you're going to likely queue into? How do you change, if you need to, your deck? Or how do you change the cards in the deck in terms of your intended use, right? Like, I've always been a huge fan of using Azure Hatcher instead of Siege Breakers when True Shot was in the meta, because I've never felt like True Shot was high enough a percentage of my opponents for me to really be adding in a tech card. But Azure Hatcher was just so versatile most of the time, and in that matchup, it was the tech card. So how do you guys think about the meta? So Spaiku, I know you just kind of like, I build a deck, I queue it in, and either I start winning, or if I start losing, I speed up. But how do you guys try to gauge the meta as you run into games?
Well, number one is just keep track of your opponent, even if it's just kind of a rough mental count. Like, oh man, I've seen a lot of Swarm today. I want to make sure that I can combat that. I'm trying to play a heavier controlling deck, but I don't have any way to deal with Bucks, or, oh man, I'm seeing a lot of Zuri, to your point before. I'm going to put in Loris into this deck just specifically to try to help out that matchup. So number one, in order to understand how to combat the decks that you're seeing, you have to know what decks you are actually seeing. If it helps you take notes, take notes. And I mean, you're probably playing this game on a phone. It's got a notes app of some kind, if it's Apple or Google, so use it. And then
Okay.
Number two, try to understand why you're winning or losing these matchups, right? Is it just, oh man, I'm playing a really heavy mid-range deck, but I don't have enough control cards. I'm just getting outrushed. Is it, man, I'm playing a rush deck, they're playing Hunter's Vengeance, and I'm just getting destroyed, and that's it? Is it that simple? Is it that you're positioning poorly? Is it that you're getting out leveled? Is it that you're cycling poorly and you just never seem to have the card in hand that you need at the time? This game, we've talked about this a handful of times. This game makes getting feedback so hard, because you could lose for any of these micro or macro decisions that you're making. And it's very difficult to isolate that variable and understand why it is exactly that you lost a game. So just kind of try to pay attention as best you can through the game when you are making decisions, why you're making them.
Yeah, Thomas, you mentioned earlier that you think about your deck in terms of 12 cards plus a sideboard. How much of a sideboard do you, and for those people who don't know, a sideboard is an old Magic the Gathering thing. You could bring a deck to a tournament, and the deck would be the cards in the deck plus a certain number of cards as a sideboard, which after your first match against your opponent, when you had to play like a best of 3 or best of 5, you could be like, oh, you're playing that deck. Well, then I'm going to take out these 2 or 3 cards, and I'm going to put these other cards in from my sideboard, which are preferential cards to have in this particular matchup. So when you build a deck, Thomas, you're not thinking about it just in terms of 12 cards. You're thinking of it in 12 cards plus a sideboard. How many cards do you consider part of your quote-unquote deck when you build it?
There's a lot, because as you know, there's so many tech cards that can be used throughout each faction and each archetype that you're playing. But when the meta is pretty wide, I'm going to first start with like when the meta is pretty wide open and there's just a lot of everything, then it's best to do one card swap at a time. As soon as I started doing that, I noticed my win rate win up a lot. There's nothing worse than swapping out 2 or 3 cards and not having any idea which one is now making some games easier and which one's making some games harder. So you pick the single weakest card in your deck and you slot that out for something else, and you play quite a few more games and decide then which one is your next weakest link in the deck. And you just keep doing that to be able to hone the deck and hone your skills with that deck, because even when you're a really great player, it takes a long time to really master any deck at all. So I would really, really recommend start when the meta is wide open, just doing one at a time until you feel very comfortably which card is the weakest card in the deck. And there's nothing worse than people misattributing wins to very weak cards or very inconsistent cards. So be open to every single card being your weakest link.
That's like, I see that fallacy all the time, Sabaiku, right? Where somebody's like, oh my gosh, this card's overpowered. You wouldn't believe how many cards I'm winning how many games I'm winning because I've got this card in my deck. Like, right. I know I've had conversations.
Veterans of War is winning me so many games.
Yes. It's like, okay.
Like, no, and you got ahead on board and you put a big chunky unit on your opponent's baseline. Any unit in that situation would have won the game. You could have played probably, any of 6 or 8 or 10 different cards, and they all would have won you that game.
Because the game's already won. The cards that you were playing on mana 3, 4, 5, and 6, those got you so far ahead that the game was already effectively decided by the time veterans came down.
Yep, 100%. So yeah, be very open to each card being the potential weakest link. And so when you're plotting out cards, it could be that one that you were really set on, but I've only played this card at a handful of times over the course of all these games. Maybe it is that card. So just keep that in mind. So that's with the wide open meta. Just do one card at a time and slowly transition each one in your deck out. So if you've got a 12 card deck, you basically go through that list of one card at a time, bring that card back in potentially to try out the next card in that 12 card list until you really know which one truly is that weakest link, and have that one permanently out and kind of revisit. So that's the wide open. And then when you get over to the times where there's just 33% of the entire meta is a particular faction or a particular archetype, you probably should have like 2 cards teched against that. So back when
2
when Ironclad aggro mid-range was the deck to play, I was playing Siegebreaker, like in my even Swarm mid-range deck, I was playing Siegebreakers, and that was back when I actually had to slot in Bucks into my Zuri deck because I just couldn't handle it otherwise. And that was a slow Swarm deck for me. So if you're seeing like 1 out of 3 games be a particular deck, you probably should have two tech cards against it,
right?
Because it's still every second or third turn before you see one of those 2 cards. So you want to be able to keep just beating them down.
Yep. To your point about those aggressive Ironclad decks, right? That was back when Scrapped Planners was a little stronger than it is now too. It was 8 strength, and then it would heal back up to 7 after it took damage. Right, you knew, number one, half of your games were going to be against Ironclad, and they were all going to have Scrapped in them. And number 2, you had to have a way to answer Scrapped, because if you didn't, you were just going to automatically lose that game.
If you were playing for me, it was 100%, because there was no other cards that were large enough to take out even a weakened Scrapped Planners.
No. Who 1C was playing Harpies of the Hunt in like all of his decks, because Harpies of the Hunt cleared, granted didn't win the trade, but cleared a damaged Scrapped Planners back then. And I remember noticing, I actually like pinged him and asked, why are you playing Harpies of the Hunt? It's not a good card. And he said, For 3 mana, it clears the scrap planners, and I have to clear scrap planners.
Yep.
And that's amazing that like the meta can warp you to the point where you're looking at Harpies of the Hunt or Mindless Horde, and you're going,
If they're really doing that much of that particular deck, I mean, why not? You know that it's essentially a coin flip before you run into it again.
Right. No, that's fair. I have also like I have there are cards that I prefer, Ubis being one of them. I just love Ubis in my 5 spot. I was always a Knife Juggler fan in Hearthstone. I love Ubis. Ubis just makes me happy. But every time I put Ubis in a deck, I tell myself this might need to be Loris. right. Like, depending upon what we see, Ubis might just not be a good card in the meta. So I put it into all of my decks when I'm theory crafting them. But in the back of my head, I just like, for the 5 spot, Loris might need to be the card that's in there instead. Do you guys have cards like that you're just like, this is half of the card that exists for me in the 4 mana spot or the 3 mana spot? Because it's when the meta's this way, it's this card, and when the mana's that way, it's that card. But these 2 cards are essentially the this or that for the mana spot.
Yeah, I'm always weighing those decisions when I'm making the deck. And sometimes it's negotiable and sometimes it's not. Recently I was trying to make clerics with cords and blood ministers work in Shadowfen, and I was trying to experiment with decks without rain in them. And I was messing around with the other 10 spots in there, but I was like, no, these two are going to be here. I'm playing a convert Shadowfen deck with these 2 cards, and that's on the extreme end of not optimizing your deck. But even then, like, it's always, do I want this trekking or do I want Lost Psyches because I want movement? It's always good. To Thomas's point earlier, every card is replaceable, so it's always good to have backup options in mind for them.
All right, that's fair. And Thomas, I assume you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. There's actually 3 pairs that immediately come to mind for me that's like, wow, which one do I really want to have in this last slot? And over the course of the month playing against the meta, you quickly find out. But in Shadowfen, we've got Toad versus Witches. It can be very hard to choose which one gets a slot if you have to give one of them the nod. In Ironclad,
helpful for that. If you're going up against a heavy swarm meta, both.
Yes.
Just want to pitch in there. If it's a heavy swarm meta, the answer is you don't want to choose between them. You want to play them both.
Absolutely.
Right, go on.
And then in Ironclad, we've got Green Gale versus Linked. I generally don't have the room to put both in, and so generally one or the other.
And what is the decision-making point on those?
For Swarm and for Shadowfen, it's Green Gale, and then against Wind and Ironclad, you want Linked.
All right. Okay. And then what's your last one?
Last one is Hunter's Vengeance versus Trekking.
Okay. And how do you choose?
You don't.
For me, that one's about how much board I think I'm going to build up in the early game. That's if I think I'm going to have a board, then no Hunter's Vengeance, and I'll put Trekking instead.
That's fair.
But oftentimes, yeah, both of those go into the same deck.
All right, moving on from there, we have resource management. You've got coins, you've got rubies, you've got fusion stones, and I will remind you that never in the history of Stormbound has anyone won a game simply because they had more fusion stones than their opponent. You might want to turn those into actual, like, impactful pieces of material, like, for example, cards. So how do we prioritize leveling up stuff? I'll start with Thomas. How have you built your deck, your library, pardon me, to enable top tier decks?
Well, so I've gone about it. We've talked about this before. I cannot remember which episode. I do remember you guys and myself disagreed slightly when I was going through my entire ranked career throughout all the different ranks, I prioritized my strong faction cards, low mana cost strong faction cards first, and then my second priority were the strong low mana cost neutrals, and then after that started building out from there. And so the reason I chose that was I figured that the best bang for my buck was the strong faction low mana cost cards, since they're slightly stronger than the neutral, even though I gave up that flexibility of the neutrals being able to go into any faction. I figured because I wasn't going to have all the resources to put it into other strong faction cards, that I might as well just target my particular faction I was in first anyway.
Huh. Okay. And Subaiku, give me what you think.
Yeah, I do tend to go the other direction. We talked way back in episode 24 about guns, generally useful neutrals. Just kind of getting all of those leveled up enables you to just play different factions a little more easily and know that you have a solid core of your deck that is still going to work, because your gifted recruits, your sparkly kitties, your green prototypes are all of a good enough level that they'll support whatever shell from whatever faction that you put around it.
Right. The guns in this game, especially since kitties have come out, like one of the things about guns when we made the guns episode was that the factions at least had the most powerful 2-drops, right? Like if you were looking for a 6/1, you would get it in, Destructobots or Dubious Hags. But now it's like, well, actually, kitties is stronger than them. Like the guns are the best. Are they not? I don't know. My personal opinion, if I was starting over with a new account, I would definitely go for. I don't even know if I would go for recruits anymore. There's definitely a lot of decks where I play both recruits and kitties, but I think between the two, I'd focus on kitties. No.
Sure, but recruits being a common, you're going to level them up faster from a new account.
I know exactly what I would prioritize, and it should be what you guys prioritize as well as what everybody else should prioritize. It is exactly our draft guide. Our draft guide tier 0 cards are the cards that you're leveling up for first.
Wait, in standard constructed ladder?
Absolutely. They're still going to be tier 0 when you start leveling them up.
Oh boy, I got to think about this. I had not contemplated this. Subaiku, I need you to talk for a minute so I can think through this.
Yeah, it's a generally solid list of cards to start with. It can be the core of a lot of decks. MERS is on there, for example, which maybe isn't as appropriate to ladder. And that's where it starts to break down for me. Draft games are at least predictably slower than most ladder games. So something like MERS, some of those value generating cards, Crazy Bombers, for example, not a card you should necessarily prioritize in ladder play, because you're probably going to try to play something a little quicker. But still, like a generally useful card. And if the game does go that late, you'll be happy you do have it leveled. But I'd probably focus on Wild Saber Paws and Sparkly Kitties first.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that, because you just triggered it in my mind. We deprioritize in draft epics because it's so hard to find epics for your upgrades. So we make the assumption when we tier the cards for draft that you're only going to see at maximum 3, more likely 2 or even just 1 upgrade on your epics. So we don't see Saberpaws as being all that powerful, because at best it's a 2/2. Whereas
I think we do have Saberpaws as a tier 1 draft card,
right?
Just because it's cheap and has movement most of the time. But I agree. In ladder, it's a tier 0 card. It's in literally every one of my decks.
And it should be. Right. And look, if you're a Swarm player, we don't rate Forgotten Souls particularly highly in draft, because it's just really hard to get the full value out of it. Forgotten Souls is a fair card until level 5. And then at level 5, oh dear graciousness, is it busted. Out of nowhere, it moves everything into base, which seems a little unfair at times, to be honest. But it's a tier 0 card in ladder.
Yeah, but yeah, so like in general though, our draft guide mostly follows the same as like all of the first place Heroes Leagues winners for the past almost year and a half now. I would say every single one of the cards that we ranked in draft would be either tier 0 or tier 1 for every single one of those decks, except for maybe Ubis, which is tier 3 in draft.
Yeah, but only because you can't get it up to level 5, and in reality, if you can get it up to level 5, it's tier 0.
Yep, but I mean,
yeah,
like,
you know what? You're right. I'm actually gonna agree with Thomas on this. It's really funny. I had not equated the two, but now that you mention it, yeah, I think you're right, Thomas.
It's a pretty good starting point for sure. You can quibble with individual card selections, but I think probably 90% of the list is going to work for you.
I could have said that a little bit better. I think that is the best way to put it. Yep.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we also, like, the draft guide prioritizes versatility. Because we don't know the specifics of your deck. We don't know exactly what you're drafting. So our tiers are really weighted for versatility. These are the best cards in general, regardless of what else you have in your deck. These are the best cards to just have and have at a high level.
Just a solid standalone card. Yep.
And if you're not sure what faction or what archetype or what specific deck you're trying to build in your library when you're getting started, that's probably a good place to be as well. Just stand alone. What are the best cards to have? And the draft guide should give you that. You're right. Huh.
Yep.
All right. So let's go from there to the final kind of concept, which is if you are a good player or even a great player, but you want to improve, what are the kinds of things that we would recommend that you do to improve? I'll start on this one because I took the time to literally I started streaming solely for the purpose of being more mindful during my games. I found that when I stream, I talk through my turns, I think about different alternatives, and I try to explain to whoever's watching why those alternatives aren't as good. When I play off stream, I tend to be just a worse player because I don't have the discipline to go through that same process, right? So for me, being more mindful about every moment, every turn, everything to consider, those kinds of things for me have helped me be a better player. What do you guys recommend?
Yeah, number one, play mindfully. Don't just have the game going while you're watching TV in the background. If you want to play to entertain yourself, that's totally fine. I'm not trying to say you have to give this game 100% of your attention all the time. I'm saying specifically, if you want to improve your game, make sure you're actually playing the game and not doing something else instead.
Right.
Number two for me is record your games and rewatch them. This is something that I started doing uploads to YouTube, specifically so that I did pay attention to what I was doing and I could go back and try to understand, oh, I made a mistake on this 6 mana turn, 7 mana turn because I could have done X, Y, or Z, but instead I did A, B, and C. And if I had done that differently, the game could have gone a different way. So going back and rewatching your games is definitely helpful. You don't need to upload them. You don't need to show them to anyone else. You can just kind of go back to them with fresh eyes a little bit later. And I think that that's really important. But while we're talking about YouTube, number three, do some research, find players on YouTube, try to watch them to understand why they're playing the way they are, and think about what kind of plays you would have done differently, why you would have done them differently, and whether the outcome would have been better or worse than what the player who uploaded the game did.
Yeah, I used to do that all the time. I used to watch Reckless Rush's videos and I would pause it before he played his turn just when his hand was there. And I would decide for myself what to cycle and what to play. and you wouldn't believe how often I was wrong. Just like he would cycle a completely different card. He would play all the none of the cards I thought he'd play. I was constantly amazed when I first got started at just how different the top players were playing their hands out than I was, because they were thinking about things like cycling and things like setting up future turns that I wasn't. I was just thinking about what's the maximum health I can put on the board right now, right? Thomas, what kinds of things have you've actually hit number one for a Heroes League season? So you have at least once been the number one player in the world. How did you achieve that? What kinds of things did you do to improve yourself?
Everything that you guys have already commented. Additionally, as crazy as it is, a person has to get off their high horse. There's always more things to learn. The moment that you think that you're basically better than everyone else is the exact time that you start getting a lot worse than everyone else, because everyone is constantly learning. So if you think that you're basically better and you quit learning from other people, you're just losing a lot of opportunity. So always be open to learning new things and asking other people what they're doing and asking dumb questions, because the more you can do that, the more little random things that you can learn about it. So I would say that that's a huge deal. I just honestly, within the last year, learned how to really properly play Gift of the Wise decks. And I've been playing for almost 4 years now. So
Wait, you know how to play Gift of the Wise decks? Can you teach me?
I still don't even know how to play Ironclad Structures. There's some amazing ones out there, and I still have not learned yet how to properly play those. And so just constantly be open to learning new things, and never assume that you're a better player than anybody else, especially those bronze players in draft. They will kick your butt.
Yes, they will.
Another big thing is don't tilt. Don't get if you make a bad play, you need to quickly address your own emotional state, because the moment that you start getting angry about things, the more emotional you start playing and the less logically you start playing. And it makes it harder and harder to win. And you just kind of go into a snowball effect when that does happen. And so after that game, log off until you can get back to a good emotional state to be able to play properly.
That's no fun.
The last tip I would give, and this one has been huge, is don't play when you're sleepy. Like if you're trying to win, do not play when you first wake up and you're making breakfast, because you will lose every single game. When I was doing that month where I was going to first place, I only played in the evening when my brain was fully active. So for each person, obviously, it depends on when your brain is most active. Some people, it's early morning. I am the opposite. So I found that if I am trying to play competitively, I do not play when my brain is not fully firing at full bore, and only play during those times of the day where it is.
That's funny, because I definitely do the opposite. I try to jam 3 or 4 games in the morning before I get out of bed. Those are typically my best games of the day. It's only downhill from there.
Wow.
So a couple of other ideas on how to improve. One of the things that when I'm building a deck for the first time and I'm theory crafting it and I'm testing it out, I try to pay attention to which cards I'm consistently cycling, right? Like if there's a card that 90% of the time it shows up in my hand, I'm like, well, this isn't useful right now. Let's cycle it. That's probably a card that doesn't belong in the deck. So if you find
micro strategy that we were talking about earlier when it came to getting those less useful cards out of your deck.
Right, exactly. So there are, you cannot under any circumstances build a deck that is favored into every matchup, right? Like, so the goal is to try to find a deck that you can play to the highest overall play rate into the meta. So that means you have to understand the meta. That means you have to understand where your skill set is. Knowing that the meta is weak to aggressive decks is fine and all, but if you suck at playing aggressive decks, that bit of knowledge is somewhat useless, because that's not your forte. And until you've honed yourself to the point where you are good at doing it, you're not going to find that jumping away from your favorite mid-range style decks into those aggressive decks that's not going to get you better win rates. So you have to kind of take all of these things into account to find your optimal point. And I mean, listen to Thomas. He's been playing for 4 years and he's still learning different archetypes. So don't be frustrated if you're like, well, I understand that I should be playing a whatever deck right now because that's what's good, but I can't. That's okay. We interviewed Stony J. I was shocked to find out when we interviewed Stony J that she's like, yeah, I can't figure out Bragda. I play Claxy because Bragda decks just they just never work out right for me. It was such a wonderful moment to hear that for me personally, because I can't make Bragda work either. So you kind of have to take all of that into account. The last thing that I will give anyone out there in terms of advice, I used to coach youth sports, and I would always tell my players this when they were struggling. It is really easy to improve when things are going your way. When you're winning a lot, when things are like, it's all coming naturally right now, and just it seems effortless, and you know every turn, and it's really easy. Every one of the players on ladder, when they're in those zones, when they're in their hot zone, they're finding it easy to play. They're finding it easy to improve. The difference in where you can move yourself further ahead of the rest of the field is when the going gets tough. Because when the going gets tough, most players turn the phone off and throw it away. They exit the game. They stop. They tilt. They do whatever it is. But one way or another, when it's not going well for them, they're getting frustrated and they're no longer improving. They're no longer being mindful. And what really helps those at the top get ahead is that even when they're losing, they're learning. They're not getting frustrated by it, but they're seeing it as the opportunity to get ahead. So if you think that everybody's going to be in the zone for give or take the same amount of time throughout a season, and everyone's going to be in a bad zone for about the same amount, right? Everybody's going to run into the same kind of losing streaks. Then that means that if you can find more value from your losing streaks than everyone else, after a couple of months, holy smokes, are you ahead of the game? That's hard to do, no doubt. But if you can do it, you'll find yourself ahead of the rest of the pack.
Well, that is well, I think what you said is exactly right. It's fantastic advice. Definitely learning from your failures is important. That's the only way that you can get better. I just wanted to point out that you didn't say the most important way to improve is to lower your curve and add a finisher.
All right. Well, that's going to end the main portion of this episode, which means it's time for me to remind you to contact us, preferably in our channel in the Stormbound Discord server, but also on Twitter at Broodsages. You can always email us at thebroodsages@gmail.com. And that's going to do it for this episode. For Sabaiku and Thomas, I am Freeloader. We are the Broodsages, reminding you to stay hydrated.